pleasure to introduce Robert Breedlove today, and I wanted to start off by a little personal story. This morning I was checking my Twitter DMs, and I scrolled back to January of 2019, and I found a message from a certain Robert Breedlove. And in that message, he said, "Hey man, I read your stuff, let's get together." And we went to a cafe, actually in Santa Monica here, and we had a conversation about Bitcoin as a living organism, a totally normal thing to do. The conversation went on for 3-4 hours, an instant friendship was built, and since then, we've all watched Breedlove go on and sort of go all in on Bitcoin, creating content, having deep philosophical conversations, and it's inspired millions of people along the way. And so I'd like to start off just by saying thank you from me and on behalf of the millions of other people in the Bitcoin community who have been impacted by your work.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And on that note, there's kind of a curious phenomenon here. What is it about this Bitcoin thing that attracts such talented people from diverse backgrounds to donate their time and their talents to promoting this idea or this thing we call Bitcoin? So I'm wondering if you can comment on this phenomenon generally and maybe share a little bit about how it's impacted you or your personal story with that.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that personal intro, actually. I'll never forget reading your work originally, Mycelium of Money, and I had already been down a bit of that rabbit hole, kind of how psychedelics are very important, and then how mycelium specifically is like the nature's internet. But when you started describing the decentralized network archetype, right, the same structure that mycelium has, we have in our brain, we see in the deepest cosmos, and that geometry is reflected in things like the internet and things like Bitcoin. So it's accessing these structures that are super robust across time, I guess even anti-fragile. And that was why I messaged you originally. It's like, this guy's on another level. I want to go have a cosmic conversation. And started a friendship. So it's really cool. As far as why Bitcoin captures your mind, and it seems to have this, like, obviously it has financial gravity, but it also has intellectual gravity, perhaps even philosophical gravity. I think about this a lot. It's a really hard question. And it seems to me that when you realize that the money is a scam, like the money is an illusion, that is one of those initial unplug moments from the Matrix. And one of the ways I describe this, I'm very caustic towards fiat currency in a lot of my work. I describe the US dollar and all fiat currencies as pyramid schemes. I think mechanically that's essentially how they operate. And when you come to the realization through Bitcoin that the most desired asset in the world, which is the US dollar, is in fact the largest scam in human history in terms of time, energy, purchasing power stolen, that really sort of short circuits your brain. I guess it short circuits your view on socioeconomic reality. It makes you question what else you may have taken for granted. And the feeling for me is that it just exploded my worldview, right? I already knew the money was a scam prior to Bitcoin, but I didn't understand Bitcoin was the solution to that major problem, which was central banking generally. And so once I connected those dots, your world opens up. You start asking a lot of other deep questions, right? Like, you go, what is money? What is value? What is accountability? What is exchange? What are all these phenomena that make us, that enable us to be a civilization, really? So the sensation is it blows apart your worldview, and then you're left kind of trying to reestablish your anchor points to reality. Like, what are the things that I can assume? What are the safe axiomatic presuppositions that I can build my worldview on? And Bitcoin seems to do that to a lot of people. Like, you come in with a preconceived notion about how the world works, how government works, how money is, whatever, maybe you've taken it for granted, and then all of a sudden the Bitcoin rabbit hole just shatters that thing, and you are left to pick up the pieces and rebuild. So I guess that process is what's sucking people into it, but that's my best wrestling with it to date, I guess.
Beautiful, thank you. You've described Bitcoin as a set of rules that cannot be broken. And I'm curious if you could explain a little bit more about what that means and why you feel that that is significant.
Yeah, I think almost all human interaction has a game-like quality to it, right? Even economics itself is, we exist in this world of unlimited human wants. We always want more. Everyone always wants more. But we have limited stuff. So we have to reconcile that inherent tension somehow, right? We can do it through conflict, or we can do it through contract. And I guess, sorry, one more time.
Yeah, a set of rules that
the
cannot
rules
be
cannot
broken.
So there's this game-like quality to human interaction. We are always trying to figure out how to establish the rules of the game in a way that everyone wants to play the game. Like I had Peterson on for the live interview in Miami, and he talks a lot about this work from John Piaget, where he describes the nature of equilibrated games versus disequilibrated games. And so, and this is through observations of childhood psychology, but in an equilibrated game, basically everyone is voluntarily and consensually choosing to play the game. This would be, when kids get together and start playing helicopter or whatever, right? They all agree to the rules. It's not like there's one kid coercing all the others, telling them what to do, and if they don't play by the rules, then they're kicked out, right? That's not play. That's something else. And there's this other form of game, which we have in things like fiat currency, that's a disequilibrated game. So the rules, it's not a consensual, market-chosen monetary system. It's one that's actually imposed by force. The very existence of the central bank legal monopoly presupposes force, right? There's a reason you can't go out and start a competing currency to the US dollar, otherwise you will get scary grams from the IRS or end up in jail or whatever. And that's the force, right? That is the enforcer imposing their will upon the populace. So the argument here from the Piaget perspective is that equilibrated games always outcompete disequilibrated games because the disequilibrated game requires that expenditure of enforcement. You have to enforce the rules, you have to shove them down people's throat, you have to enforce breakage of the rules, you have to protect the turf of that monopoly, right, on rules making. And it's just inefficient, essentially. And the problem is, like, the way I look at the central bank is that it's effectively setting the rules, that's public rule, if you will, that we use a dollar system. But behind closed doors, those rules can be twisted and broken, right? That's what inflation effectively is you expect this dollar to maintain its integrity across time, yet there's one institution that we've arrogated the exclusive legal privilege to produce more of the thing that we all have to use. So inside of that legal monopoly, you can produce new units of currency and dilute everyone else. It's not only is that twisting the rules and confusing all of our market actions and entrepreneurial efforts, but it's also enriching them at the same time. So now the incentives become, we're now rewarding non-productive people inside of that legal monopoly. So now the incentives really, and the more that theft occurs, the greater that incentive becomes. So the incentive for human beings that we now wrestle with is, well, do I go out and do something productive in the world and satisfy the wants of my fellow man? Or do I try to go play this political game where I can get aligned to the fiat currency spigot and just get rich ad infinitum? And so there's this really pernicious issue. And at the end of the day, we all just want a level playing field, I think. As participants in this market process, we want the money to have integrity. We want to be able to, to have strong property rights. We want a reliable and predictable rule of law so we can resolve the inevitable disputes that come up non-violently, efficiently. And we're destroying all of that when we print money, right? It's effing up the entire game. And we'll talk about this more later, but I think it also drives people crazy. And if you just consider that, if you sit down to play, you guys may have heard me say this before, you sit down to play a game of poker in Las Vegas, and you're at some weird casino where they're changing the hand rankings or the rules every few hands, no one wants to voluntarily play that game. You're going to go bananas, right? Like, you can't make sense of the game. You can't build a strategy. You can't play. And so if you break the rules in poker that way and it totally debilitates the game, how much more so does the breaking of rules in economics debilitate our ability to produce wealth and satisfy human wants and engage in entrepreneurial activities that are value additive rather than extractive? So it's all, and I guess Bitcoiners are big on game theory for this reason. Like, it's all about playing games ultimately. We're playing games with one another all the time. There's a big incentive to try to be the rule maker, because if I can make the rules, I can win in perpetuity. You can never beat me if I'm the central bank or I'm the casino or whatever it is. And what people really want is just the level playing field. Like, give me fair, clear, and transparent rules, and then make them unbreakable. And that lets all of us play the game as best as we can, and hopefully, in a Bitcoin world, create more wealth and capital than we've ever done before.
So if I'm hearing you right, it sounds like at the incentive level, what's happening here is Bitcoin is empowering the productive class at the expense of the political class. And the downstream effects of that are very good for society, as productive capital goes to the market forces and producing value and competing in the real world, and the benefits and the efficiencies that come from that spill over into society.
Yeah, it's like, real simply, I could say human beings are going to do whatever is profitable to do. So if human beings can steal from other human beings profitably, they will do that. That's what the central bank is, right? It's one of the most profitable ways to steal in human history, because it's scaled out and we all use it and we don't understand it, and it's worked really well for a long time. But if I get in the framing here for Bitcoin is like, it's just making theft more expensive, which is to say it's making stealing from other humans less profitable. And that is a really big deal. That's what's so good about it.
And on net, it sounds like that would actually increase morality in society. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting rabbit hole, right? We wrote a book about it, Thank God for Bitcoin, which is kind of exploring the ethical and moral dimensions of money through a Christian lens. It's fascinating to me, actually. I've been thinking about this recently, and this might hopefully not be too deep down the rabbit hole, but most people here probably know that the integrity of Bitcoin's supply is secured by proof of work. This is a process that participates in thermodynamic reality. We have the expenditure of energy that goes into a game, right? The miners are competing amongst each other to solve a puzzle, and the output of that is new block of transactions every 10 minutes and adherence to the fixed supply cap of 21 million. So we have anchored a monetary system into the physics of reality that now produces something with perfect supply integrity. We've never had a money with perfect supply integrity. Prior to Bitcoin, the best thing we had was gold, right? Which was also secured by proof of work. It required energy to discover, mine, refine, and circulate gold that protected that supply from being inflated or counterfeited, which are the same thing, as you've probably heard me say before. Now, okay, so that's interesting. We have a tool rooted in physics that has perfect supply integrity. But here's where things get weird, because when you start interacting with Bitcoin, we often say this, right? It lowers your time preference, which is to say, simply having the ability to preserve the fruits of your labor across time, right? In a medium that you own a guaranteed fraction of. So if you have 100 Bitcoin, you have a guaranteed fraction of that total money supply, right? 100 of 21 million. That simple shift in incentive allows us to think longer term about our decisions, to think about the implications of our actions on not only others, but a greater amount of others across time, greater slices of ourself across time, right? Because it's another thing, every action we take is basically a trade with our future self, right? You're either investing or consuming in any moment. And just by virtue of having this really strong savings tool, you can now become more engaged in that process. And the Austrian economists and libertarian philosophers would say, I think, the lowering of your time preference is equivalent to the raising of your morality. So a tool rooted in the physics of reality with perfect supply integrity becoming an incentive that actually shifts individual moral integrity towards a lower time preference. That is fucking mind-blowing to me. And I don't know if we can get our head around it. We just have to see how it plays out. But there's this old philosopher, David Hume, said you can't get an ought from an is, which is to say that there are distinct domains, right? The material, physical, objective domain and the subjective, moral, ethical domain. Yet Bitcoin, being as interesting as it is, seems to be maybe a bridge. Somehow we go from the is of physics, and now we have this ought of lowering time preference or elevated morality. That's fascinating to me.
Absolutely. Let's talk about paradoxes for a second. For some reason, Bitcoin is littered with paradoxes. We could probably list a dozen off right now. But one that came to mind, considering we're at a Bitcoin conference, is the difference between love and hate. And if you look on Bitcoin Twitter, especially to the uninitiated, it appears to be a volatile, harsh, potentially even toxic environment. And then you could show up at a Bitcoin conference, like we all are here today, and it's filled with love. And so I'm wondering if you can comment on either the paradoxes in general with Bitcoin or maybe how you see that specific one.
Yeah, that one's very fascinating because you can be on Bitcoin Twitter and you would think most Bitcoiners are psychopathic, cultist, shit-talking maniacs.
And you wouldn't be wrong.
And you wouldn't be wrong in that domain, but then you come to this domain and all I see are people loving each other up. I mean, it could not be more opposite. And, when I look at that, and I've had kind of my own wrestling with the idea of toxicity. It wasn't something that felt good to me initially. Like the cultural norms associated with it are not an approach I would typically take. However, I have to be real with myself, especially as we're going through this latest crypto shitcoin blow up, right, as expected. That toxicity, or you could maybe call it tough love online, serves a real purpose. There's a real utility to that. It's actually saved people money, and it's gotten people out of these scammy crypto projects prior to their collapse. So I've had to have this check on myself that, maybe I had a blind spot. I didn't see the utility of toxicity, which you see rampant on Bitcoin Twitter. It is kind of a toxic cesspool in a way. Also a really good tool. People are exchanging good ideas, but let's just say that the interpersonal friendliness is quite lacking typically on Bitcoin Twitter. However, again, as we were just describing, Bitcoin has this weird transformative influence on people. It's causing us to have a lower time preference more generally. And then when you see people congregating in meet space under these common values that Bitcoin represents, and maybe having undergone some of that transformative process themselves, I think you get this, right? My experience at these events is I get mobbed with love. That's my best description of it. And I love you all, and thank you for doing that. Every time you tell me the work matters to you or it helps your life, that gives me incredible fulfillment and the energy to keep doing it. So Bitcoin does have a lot of paradoxes, but that's one interesting one, I guess.
Yeah. Let's do one more paradox. I like these. And it's about individualism versus collectivism. And I would say most people would agree that Bitcoin is the strongest tool or shield for an individual to protect themselves against a would-be oppressor, whether that's a despotic government, a corporation, any number of things. And at the same time, Bitcoin is a collective of individuals who form this weird socio-political, cultural union to then go enact political change, which we believe is better for the group, right? So it is both, and that's a paradox.
Yeah, it is. And we've always had to live in participation with a collective, which is to just say, I mean, we use these terms, the collective, like there's a collective out there, but it's ultimately just this, right? Human interaction, human participation, the game, right? It's another game. It's how do you coordinate all of these human beings such that you can minimize suffering and maximize want satisfaction, essentially. And you know, a lot of authors have written about this, about the struggle between the individual and the collective. And I guess you could go back to Christ as being one of the original ones, right? The individual standing against the state, speaking truth to power. Ayn Rand wrote a lot about this much later on, but that entire, I actually read this book recently, and I've talked about this on some of my latest podcasts, but this book titled Inventing the Individual, that argues the individual didn't really exist as a socioeconomic conception before Christ. So post-Christ, we get this Western civilization that we're a part of, but now you have this very strong tension between the individual will and the collective will, let's say. And we've tried a lot of different governance experiments to reconcile this tension. You know, we've had authoritarianism, we've had fascism, communism, Marxism, pseudo-capitalism here in the US. And it's a problem that we have to solve. And I think that it's a problem that's best mediated with a boundary of property. That's why I talk about property till I'm blue in the face on the show. I think the stronger your property rights are and your person and your stuff, that the more where my self-interest ends would be where yours begins. That we can't actually infringe on one another's property rights, and that's what creates kind of a peaceable society. So with Bitcoin, that's what you have. We have this technology that optimizes the integrity of the individual's property, right? I can hold something that's independent of everyone's actions or opinions about it. There's no government that can pass a law to separate me from my Bitcoin. There's no central bank that can inflate it to dilute me for my purchasing power in Bitcoin. And I have this unprecedented portable tool too. So if my government does start to treat me bad, I can skip capital controls and go to where I'm treated best. So we have this tool that's radically empowered the individual with an unparalleled degree of optionality in terms of wealth preservation, mobility, self-sovereignty, right? The same thing we talk about all the time. And that the people adopting that tool seem to be gravitating towards these common values that are then becoming a collective. So I think Bitcoin is kind of hopefully a kernel to a more ideal civilization. You know, I'm very skeptical of utopian vision and all of that, but all we really need to do is preserve life, liberty, and property and let people self-organize, and those have been the most successful economic experiments in history. That's why the US is so rich. That's why we have FANG stocks. That's why we have digital technology and smartphones, and we go to outer space. It's like life, liberty, property, leave people alone. And so that is the magic of Bitcoin. It's like we don't need to talk about it and write it down on the Magna Carta or the US Constitution and trust that not only these guys will honor what's said in that document, but generations to follow them will continue to honor it. That game doesn't work. With Bitcoin, you just have an incentive schema. And so it's much less profitable to violate life, liberty, and property. So hopefully the collectives that form on top of that are more sustainable, more prosperous, and hopefully a better reflection of our better angels.
Amen. All right, let's talk about timing for a second. Bitcoin was born in the ashes of the global financial crisis. It's becoming a teenager in a time where central bank digital currencies are starting to gain popularity around the world, which is also the exact time when we would need a tool like Bitcoin. Some say this timing is divine. Others say it's pure coincidence. I'm wondering if you can comment on your thoughts on timing in Bitcoin.
There's no question that the release of Bitcoin was strategic. I mean, what Satoshi put in, was it Chancellor on second
Brink of the bailouts
of the banks? Yeah, so it was released at a strategic time, right? The bottom of the 2000 2007, 2009 recession. It was very clear at that point there was going to be excessive quantitative easing, excessive counterfeiting of currency. So if you're going to release an open source monetary project and its main value proposition is it cannot be counterfeited or inflated, best to do that right when they're going to be inflating and counterfeiting like crazy. So there's no question that there was some intent there. But more largely, the timing does feel a little weird. It's like humanity just seemed to be on the brink. We're still on the brink, right? Like society's kind of tearing itself apart in a lot of ways. We have this weird cultural malaise, a lot of mass psychosis. I think we've seen unfold in the world. Hopefully it's subsiding. But when you study history, these things tend to get a little bit worse before they get better. So, the timing, it was strategic, but it also feels very, I don't want divine intervention or something. We needed this. Human beings just keep printing money, and you debase the monetary protocol. The political protocols built on top of that monetary protocol ultimately fail as well. Civilization collapses, and then we got to rebuild the whole thing. We've been doing this boom and bust civilizational cycle for a lot of thousands of years. And it seems to me like if we could just have a money that we can't counterfeit, that we could actually save ourselves from that self-destructive pattern or tendency. So I'm glad we hopefully have a solution that can save us from ourselves.
Yeah, it brings to mind nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And it certainly feels that Bitcoin's time has come. All right, last question. It's going to be about symbiosis. And I believe that humans and technology are symbiotic. As humans, we shape tools. Those tools go on and reshape us. Now we're new types of humans who create new tools to infinity. And for example, humans discovered fire. We learned to cook. That liberates more nutrients, which shrinks the size of our gut, which creates more room to grow our brains, which allow language, etc. And in the same way, Bitcoin is a tool. And now that we create Bitcoin, we start interacting with it. Bitcoin starts to change us at the individual level. I believe this scales up to the society level. And I'm curious how you view this as a catalyst to change humanity.
This is one of the things I find to be most fascinating is this reciprocal influence of man and tool. Like we are involved in the creative process, but then our creations in turn make us, and we go on and make greater creation. It's very fascinating. It's like a feedback loop in biology. And there's a lot I could say here, but in the interest of time, there's a great book titled A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism by Hoppe I've really been getting into. And he makes this kind of simple point that once you start rewarding non-productive people, right, and then the switching costs from a productive role into a political role is relatively low, that people will start, again, doing what's profitable. So if there's more money to be made working inside of the government and stealing from people, more people will do that. Now, over time, this actually changes their personality, right? You forget how to be productive if you live inside of a political environment and you're constantly practicing intrigue and deception and all these things that are not necessarily productive in the real economy. So when you describe that interface between man and tool, there you go. If you have corrupt money that's used to violate private property rights and make stealing more profitable, you get more people going into that line of work, more people's personalities being reshaped towards this political, non-productive, theft-oriented behavior and away from productive reality. So right there, corrupt money corrupts individuals. So what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin's incorruptible money. Maybe we can use it to de-corrupt ourselves.
Fix the money, fix the world. Robert Breedlove, everybody.